Hey everyone, and welcome back to the show. The Real Stuff podcast has this audience guest form online where you can go and you can apply to be a guest on the show. It's luciefink.com/apply. And we get some pretty crazy stories sent to this email address. And this one that came in was just too interesting to pass on. It sounded to me like a movie plot and something that I just couldn't believe actually happened in real life. The guest on the show, as you will see, asks us to change her name and to not show her face. So if you are watching on YouTube, you're not going to see today's guest, but we are keeping her voice the same, and we choose a name for her so that you can kind of follow along with the story. In the interview, we dive right into the plot and the drama of what's going on in this story. So I do think it's important to give you a little bit of background going into it so you kind of know what we're talking about. Otherwise, you might be a little confused from the get-go. So here's a piece. I'm just going to read to you a piece of her initial email that she sent to The Real Stuff for her application. Hi, Lucie. My submission is somewhat unique, which is why I think it will make an interesting podcast. Essentially, my best friend from high school and I had a brutal falling out right before my wedding. Our friendship had been deteriorating for years, but it was still a huge blow and something I still mourn. Last year, I learned she'd published a book with Penguin Random House, which was a novel about a friendship breakup spurred by a wedding. Of course, I bought and read the book, and yes, it was basically about me and her. In fact, several of the chapters were written to me in the second person. What I'd like to talk about the podcast would be first how she plagiarized my childhood for her novel without my consent, sharing details about my past and my family. And second, she blended the truth, real verbatim conversations with fiction, which mortifies me to think about the people who know me believing that I said some pretty horrible things. So that was just a piece of her email to me. And now that you know the general story, I'm going to let you hear all of the specifics as we dive into them together. I just feel like that setup was essential because she kind of mentions the book pretty early on, and I want you to know what we're talking about. Just a note, when I do a podcast episode like this where it's someone telling a story or their take on something, I think it's important for all of us to remember that we are hearing one person's side and one person's perspective on what happened here. Not that in a situation like this, one of the two of them needs to be right and the other wrong, or not that someone needs to be the bad one. Not everything is black and white, and there are gray areas. But we do need to keep in mind as we listen that we are only hearing one side of a two-sided story, and that maybe if we heard it told from the other side, our perception would change and be very different. I actually did consider reaching out to the author of the book and seeing if she had anything that she wanted to say on the podcast, maybe a voice recording, any comments she wanted to make, just to make this for you as the listeners a little bit more of a multi-dimensional story. But I decided against it. I realized that I'm not doing, an investigative journalism piece where I need to get a comment from the other party. This episode is just a personal story about the emotions and, one of the two parties, how this felt for them. So keep that in mind as you listen. We don't have everyone's account of what happened here, but either way, I would love to hear your thoughts and your take on the situation in the comments of the podcast. So please write us on YouTube under the video, or please leave a comment on Instagram at The Real Stuff Pod. Thank you in advance. I hope to do more episodes like this where we have people come on and tell us the craziest stories of things that have ever happened to them. And I really hope you enjoyed today's episode. First and foremost, what should we change your name to? What's a name you've always loved?
Well, I thought we could use the names from the book if you want. Because
That would be
that's
fun.
easy. Yeah, I won't forget them. So in the book, she calls me Izzy and she calls herself Savannah.
Okay, Izzy and Savannah. So, hi, Izzy. How are you?
I'm okay. How are you doing?
I'm doing pretty well. Where are you coming at us from?
I am in my office in Connecticut. Yeah, this is my little sanctuary.
I love it. So I get a ton of submissions for this podcast, and a lot of them are people's personal stories, relationship struggles, or financial hurdles that they've gone through in their lives. But what I have never heard is someone writing in with a story quite as intricate and bizarre as this one. So I want to go back to the start of your friendship with Savannah. And, let's kind of forget what we all know is going to happen and just sort of go back to your childhood with her. What was your
Yeah.
relationship like?
So, oh my gosh, I'm so worried I'm going to use her real name by accident, but I guess we can edit that out if I do. So to go all the way back to the beginning, Savannah and I did ballet together when we were 5. And she went to a different school, but she lived less than a mile down the street from me, and she was an only child. And in 3rd grade, she started at the same elementary school as me. And her mom reached out to my mom and said, can Izzy take Savannah under her wing? She doesn't know anyone at this school. She's an only child. She's very shy, a big bookworm. And I remember like the first day we were on the bus together. I still remember it. And that, she had this little lamb toy that she had from Ireland. And we talked about that. And she promptly forgot it on the school bus, which is very her, actually. And we were sort of best friends ever since then. She was always a voracious reader. And I think she had a really big imagination, and she always has. It was one of the things that I've always loved about her. But she was also very dramatic. We were teenage girls. We went through all of our sort of pieces together, and I have 2 older brothers, which she talks about in the book, and she has no siblings, so we were really like sisters. We spent every single day together, and it was very much like an open door policy to each other's houses for the most part, and we went on vacations together. We were as close as 2 best friends can really be. So that was our relationship, up through college, really.
Do you remember in your childhood getting into any fights with her?
Yes. It's funny that you say that, actually, because I've obviously been sort of stewing on this since the book came out about a year ago. And one of the biggest fights I remember we ever had was when we were 13. And I don't remember what the fight was about, but I do remember the phrase that sort of stabbed me in the back was she told me, "I've outgrown you." And it cut me so deep, obviously you're 13, you're so vulnerable. I didn't have boobs yet. And, and it was so hard to hear. And it's funny because this sort of feels like the same thing. Reading the book is very much like she talks about it in the book, basically just feeling like she's outgrown this mold, but it was the same kind of fight where she just was, thinking that like I didn't have anything to offer her or something like that. But we never really thought about boys. We were always really good about that. We were never interested in the same boys. And she was always the boss. Like if there was an alpha and a beta, I was definitely the beta. And I'm okay with that. I did not want to be the one that was in charge. I was always like the sweeter one of the 2 of us. And I liked that dynamic because she kind of would stand up for me when I couldn't stand up for myself also. Even
though she said that she outgrew you, you guys did continue your friendship through college.
Oh yeah, absolutely. We were very close through college. And I don't know if you want me to get into it now, but like the crux of the book, basically the catalyst moment was when I got engaged. In the book, she sets that in college, but in reality, I was, several years out of school by then.
Okay, so yeah, we will get to the whole hoopla around the wedding and the engagement.
Yeah.
But first, I'm trying to understand from this relationship dynamic that you had with Savannah at a very young age, the way you describe it, alpha and beta, or, someone kind of being in command and someone else maybe being more submissive. Did you feel bullied by her? Did you feel like intimidated by her and you wanted her to like you and almost like you were following and she was the leader?
Yeah. I mean, she was always the one setting the tone, sort of setting the pace. And it honestly never really bothered me. But now that I am a 30-year-old woman and who's been in therapy, it's funny because you think about, I think for a lot of people, they have that little voice in the back of their head that says like, that's an ugly outfit or you should lose 10 pounds or whatever it is. And for a lot of people, I think that's their mom, unfortunately. For me, it's Savannah. And I really think that, when I go into work, I go into the city very occasionally to meet with clients. And every single time I'm on the subway, I'm worried that I'm going to run into her and that she's going to think that I look like a suburban mom. I can't help but feel so self-conscious that she thinks, she's created this box for this person that she thinks I am. And that's very clear in this book. In the book, she makes me like a stereotypical sorority girl who is, who only cares about material things and whatever it is. And I dread that because it's so not the person that I am. And I think, oh my gosh, if I run into her, she's going to look me over once and think, oh yeah, because I haven't dyed my hair pink or put a tattoo on my neck yet. I haven't done any of those things that I think she would deem worthy.
Are you a suburban mom right now?
I am, yes.
Okay, great. So we're part of that same club there.
Yes, yeah.
And I guess to that point, hearing someone talk about a friendship like this, I can relate to having childhood friends who were a little bossy or a little bit bitchy and kind of the ringleaders of the group.
Yeah.
And at the time, you're a little bit intimidated by them and you want to be liked by them. I mean, what 13-year-old doesn't want to be in with the crowd? But now being in your 30s, being a mom, being out of the city and reflecting on this relationship, do you even think this friendship that you had with her was a healthy friendship that you would even want to be part of right now?
You know, I think about that a lot, and I talk with my mom about it a lot, and because she was really close with our whole family, and it's hard to say because like one of the weird things my mom once said is she's like, I really think that if you guys were still friends, she would find a way to sabotage something like your marriage. And I would never have thought of something like that. And I don't necessarily think that it was a very healthy dynamic all the time, but I do think we pushed each other in ways that were good sometimes. And I do think that we had very real conversations about, the world and, having such a similar upbringing. I mean, literally living down the street from each other, we were able to talk about, our privilege and our experience and I miss that. And there's aspects of the relationship that I do really miss. Like it makes me really sad that she'll never know my daughter. And that kind of breaks my heart. But at the same time, I feel like, I mean, I was always looking over my shoulder, sort of like in the sense that I wondered what she was thinking about what I was doing, which is not necessarily healthy. And now I know that like all the worst things I ever wondered if she was thinking about me, she was, and then some. It's like horrifying
Right.
realization to be like, oh wow, when I did this thing that I thought maybe they were judging me for, they were judging me for it. And that's really like a slap in the face. I can't even articulate what a weird sensation that is to sort of read someone's private thoughts about you.
So let's go to this engagement and sort of the start of the end of the friendship. In the book, it was around college time. In reality, you were more in your mid 20s.
Mm-hmm.
What actually happened at that time?
So we had definitely been growing apart for a few years. Certainly in college, she went to a theater conservatory for school. And so that was a very different dynamic than, I went to a small school in the South, which she talks about in the book, of course. And so we've been growing apart in some ways. Like she had moved to Brooklyn and was very much involved in, like more of like the hipster Brooklyn scene, as one does, which I always really liked and liked being a part of. But I did sort of get this like creeping sensation that she was embarrassed of me, that I was like not living up to the cool girl vibe that she was creating for herself. This entire time too, she's amassed a pretty large following on Instagram. So she's really got like created this persona. And when I got engaged, I will say I was 24, and being from Westchester, that was like very shocking to people to get engaged at 24, which is so wild because in the rest of the country, that's no one would bat an eye at getting engaged at 24. Like that's a pretty normal age. But even my friends from the Northeast were kind of like, aren't you a little young to be getting married? And I feel like that was also her reaction a little bit, but she kind of hid that from me. The thing that happened that was sort of like the catalyst of the real end of our friendship was I didn't think that she should be in the bridal party. And I felt like she was going to feel really awkward on the day. She had made no effort with any of my other friends. She wouldn't come to my bachelorette. She didn't come to my bridal shower. Like there had been a lot of things. I called her to talk about the wedding and she was like, I don't think I can be your maid of honor. And I was like, that's awkward because I wasn't going to ask you to be my maid of honor. I was like, I actually think that like you might enjoy the wedding more just as a wedding guest.
Can I just stop you here and figure out,
Sure.
at this point, it sounds like you had thought a lot in your head about her place in your wedding.
Yeah.
Taking out, whatever happened, who did you want as your maid of honor and why did you not want her? And then why did this lead you into not even thinking she should be part of the bridal party?
Basically, to put a long story short, she and my brother engaged in a relationship and it didn't end well. And so that created a lot of problems in our friendship for years, honestly.
When was that?
That was when we were in high school.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yes. The end of high school. Yeah. So her perspective and my perspective, this is like the perfect part where I would say that it very much differs what happens. From my perspective, I was like the jilted friend who had a secret kept from her and was very hurt. From her perspective, she felt like, this older boy gave her too much attention and it wasn't necessarily a good thing. And I think that the truth is definitely somewhere in the middle. But at the end of the day, I have my perspective and she has hers. So we had sort of grown apart, and I was like, you don't really want to be around him. We both know that. And, this will be easier. And it's interesting because she puts this conversation in the book, like almost word for word. But what she leaves out is when we had this conversation, she completely, and this again was very hurt, made the whole wedding about her, where she was like, we talked about you getting married. We talked about you picking out a dress together. We talked about all these things. And I was like, I know we talked about all these things when we were kids, but I'm not getting married to you. So this is really about me and my future husband, who I think she names like Chad or something horrible in the book. But it was really surreal to read that conversation on the pages of the book because she took it like verbatim, but then of course leaves out all of the sort of self-indulgent moments that she had. And I was like, oh wow, this is a trip.
Just so we're clear, does she mention in the book her relationship with your brother?
Yeah, that's actually a big part of the book. Yeah.
Okay.
And one of the reasons why I wanted to be anonymous in this, because she says some things about him that are very unflattering, and I wouldn't want that to be something haunting him.
Okay, so you call her, you tell her, I don't think, or she calls you and says, I don't think I could be your maid of honor. And you say, I wasn't going to ask you that. And then is this the same phone call where you tell her that she shouldn't be part of the bridal party either?
Exactly. Yeah.
So what was the final outcome of this conversation?
We ended on a note that was sad, where it was like, I know this isn't how we pictured one of us getting married. And I knew that she walked away from that conversation sort of surprised. And to read the hurt from her perspective gave me really mixed feelings, because the whole time in the book, she talks about how she dreads every phone call from me. But then she's like, wow, I'm not going to be a part of the rehearsal dinner. I'm not going to be the one making the toast. I don't know if I gave that enough sort of weight when we did have that conversation, because I was also a hurt friend. She calls me up and tells me I can't be your maid of honor. And I'm like, well, but it left me with such mixed feelings to read about it, because I was also coming from a hurt place by that time.
So you have this falling out around your wedding. Does she end up coming to your wedding?
No, and she didn't tell me that she wasn't coming to the wedding for months. And then I had gotten basically all my RSVPs back, and I hadn't gotten the RSVPs back from her or her parents. And that's when I was like, this is very odd. So then I called and texted her, probably every day for 2 weeks, and I never heard anything back. So I finally called her mother, and I was like, what is going on? Like, please tell me what's going on. And she basically was like, you need to talk to Savannah. Then I got a very cryptic letter in the mail from her, basically the thesis of which was, sometimes boundaries are for you and not for the person setting them. And it was super vague, and she never spoke to me again. That was it. And that was 5 years ago.
Sometimes boundaries are for you, not the person setting them.
Yeah.
Is this her way of telling you, I should set this boundary for you because I'm about to publish a book about you?
So I think that she had the idea of the book in her mind at that point. And I think she'd already been writing it. Like, some of the chapters are literal, I don't think I've said this, are literal like journal entries that she writes to me in the first person. I can't even tell you how odd that was to like open chapter 2 and it's like, you're sitting there by the pool putting on tanning oil. And I'm like, wait, am I hallucinating? Like, is she writing this to me? That could have been it, but like, she never reached out to me to tell me about the book. I had to find out about it through Instagram, which I'm not even on. Like literally my brother's girlfriend reached out to me and was like, by the way, Savannah's writing this book and I think it might be about you. And then I read the description and it's like, when Savannah's best friend Izzy gets married. And I was like, oh my God. So yeah.
Can you describe the physical sensations that you felt when your brother's girlfriend sends you this and you click into it and you're just sitting by yourself looking at this link online?
Yeah, because I feel it like now. It's like a nervousness where it's like a hot feeling radiating from your chest to your palms, where you're like, oh my God, what is this? And it's anxiety, it's anger, and then a little bit of part of me is flattered. And I can't deny that, where I'm like, wow, you really had to think about me so much that you had to write a book about our friendship. Like, okay, I'm glad that it meant as much to her as it did to me, that it like made it to the pages of these. But I mean, it's a truly overwhelming sensation.
Thank you so much to Dreamland Baby for sponsoring today's episode of the show. Their pajamas have been our family's absolute favorites ever since we got our first pair of hand-me-down zip-up pajama onesies from Michael's cousin, who had a baby a few years before us. By the time she passed them down to us, they were already so soft because the Luxe Weave fabric just gets softer and softer with every cycle through the washing machine. These pajamas are so high quality, they're long-lasting, and if you know anything about baby clothes, you know that sometimes the really cheap ones can be kind of see through, they tear easily, and these are not see through and they don't rip. The other thing I find is that usually the good quality clothes that are not see through end up being stiff and rigid, but these are just so silky and soft and stretchy. And as Milo has grown, we've obviously transitioned out of the zip up footies. We're now in their 2-piece sets, and he wears them every single night. Go to dreamlandbabyco.com and enter my code all caps real stuff at checkout for 30% off the pajamas plus free shipping. That's dreamlandbabyco.com, code real stuff all caps. The offer is for new and existing customers. Can we go over some of the details in the book that tipped you off to knowing that it was about you? Obviously, there were a lot of really realistic details, but what were some of the things that she took from your life and kept exactly as is, and what were some of the things that were changed a little?
So everything from our childhoods was pretty accurate. Like she talks about our afternoons basically at my parents' house. She takes details from both of our lives and all of the worst things she puts into my character. So she has my family be like a wealthy real estate family, but that actually is her family, which I thought was really actually an interesting choice on her part. Obviously, she talks about my two brothers and she talks about our joint Sweet 16 that we had together. Like there were a lot of things. There was a big incident in high school where we had a huge fight, basically about her relationship with my brother, where I was like very upset, very, just so young and just so hurt by them having a romantic relationship that it spilled over to a lot of people in the school basically lashing out at her. And she put that in the book, which was really, really hard for me to read because it's probably one of the things in my life that I'm least proud of. And that all is in there. And that, when I was reading that part of it, that's when I was like, okay, there's no one from our past who could read this book and think that this isn't about me and her. And that was like the worst part because everything up until my engagement is pretty accurate. And then she embellishes. She has me have this like really ostentatious bridal shower, which did not happen. I had a bridal shower in my parents' backyard. It was like practically a barbecue. And then she also has me go on a transphobic tirade at the like towards the end of the book, which I would never do. And so I read these things and I'm like, someone from high school will read this and think that both of those things are true and those are the invented things.
And to be clear, she is bisexual. Was she out as bisexual in high school and college?
I'm trying to think. She started dating a woman after college. And the irony, too, is that I am bisexual and have been out for longer than she has, but there's no room for that in the book. So, of course, that doesn't make it in there because that would ruin the stereotypical sorority girl trope.
Wow, that is an interesting fact.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about, I know you mentioned in your letter, like a blanket or something?
Oh my God, this was like one of the hardest chapters for me to read. So, like, freshman year of college, she was very into like the boho decorating style. We all were obsessed with decorating our dorm rooms. I'm sure you went through the same phase. I saw this like really cute fringe blanket and it said good at naps on it. And it was like black and white. And I was like, oh my God, she's going to love this. And I almost got her a leather bound journal because she loves to write. And I've gotten her probably 50 journals over the course of her life. So I'm like hyping up this present because I know it's going to look so good in her new big girl apartment. And she hates it. She absolutely hates this gift. And she's like, I don't nap. And I was like, that's kind of not the point. Like, it's a cute blanket and it's really cozy and you love to be cozy. But she writes about it in the book from her perspective. And to her, it's like this light bulb moment of, oh my God, Izzy doesn't know me at all. She thinks that I nap. And it's like, it's so crazy because I know that she would have loved a journal, but I was trying to get her something that she didn't have. And like, I obviously know it from my perspective, but she turned it into this like snowball of she's never known who I am. She doesn't see me as the person that I am. She thinks I take naps. And I was like, oh my God, it wasn't that deep. So that was hard to read. And that made me honestly really pissed, where I was like, really? We're gonna like put this in here?
You find out about the book, and then how does your family react to this, specifically your brother?
Oh my God, we've never told my brother about the book.
He doesn't know about it.
He might know about it, but we don't talk about it with him because it would just like wreck his day like, or his year. It's wrecked my year. Um, so we haven't talked about it. My mom was livid, especially because she drags my parents in the book in a really specific way. Like my mom has really struggled with alcohol, and she actually had an incident during COVID where she really needed to seek professional help, and she had to get it. And she puts the fact that she struggled with alcohol in the book, and it's such a fuck you, because it's like that is so personal. And also they were never anything but so kind and so generous, and took her on a million family vacations, and always treated them as one of their own. So my mom was deeply hurt by the book. I had to beg her not to read it because I knew that it would really upset her. And also, she actually talks about my sexual assault in the book, and I really did not want my mom to read that. And that was really disturbing to me because it really wasn't a part of the book that drove the plot forward. I don't know why she included it, and she never asked for my consent. And it's like, for someone who is such an advocate for survivors of sexual assault, for her to do that, it blew me away. And I just was, that's a big part of the reason I didn't want my mom to read the book, because who wants to read that about their child? That's horrible.
When was that?
That was when we were in college. And she writes about it like pretty specifically, and she changed only a couple very minor details. That was really shocking. Honestly, that was beneath her, and I'm surprised that she would do that. And the craziest part to me is that it's like one paragraph of the book that so just didn't need to be there.
In what type of light is it presented?
So she presents it in the sense that we're having one of our like catch up phone calls. I remember the conversation, and it was a very serious conversation where I was like, hey, this happened to me. I didn't even process what happened to me at the time. It took me like a year to even realize that, I'd been through something non-consensual, because, I feel like our generation is the first generation to even be talking about consent like this. I remember we had that conversation, but in the book, she says, she basically makes it like I make a flippant comment where I'm like, so and so entered me without my consent, but he was hot, so I guess it's no big deal. And I'm like, that isn't the conversation. Maybe that was, no, there's no version of that where I found that like it was okay that she put that in there.
And I mean, even if that's how it was said, there's no knowing how someone feels internally about that situation. And so to write
Exactly.
it, yeah, I understand there being no consent and her kind of using that being upsetting.
It was. My oldest brother, his girlfriend read the book. He did not want to read the book, and she was equally horrified by the details and some of the things that happened in the book that are true and personal to me.
So after you read this book, I know you said you guys haven't spoken since then. Did you ever send her any outreach about it?
I can't believe I didn't put this in my note to you. So, okay, so I may have been the beta, but I am not a quiet person. I don't go quietly. I knew that she was doing like a book tour, and I was like, I'm not going to her book tour with all her fans. Like, I'm not doing that. As much as I wanted to share my side of the story, I'm not a vengeful person. Like, I don't want to go and like ruin her moment that she's got her first book published. Like, that is not my style. But I am mutuals on TikTok with the girl who runs Bad Bitch Book Club, and they were doing her book for one of the months. And I was like, oh, well, this is surreal, because like I like this girl and she's going to read this book about me and she doesn't even know. And I was like, this is so weird. But then I was like, she posted that the author was going to be at the book club. And I was like, okay, this is not a group of her fans. This is not on her tour. I wouldn't be ruining her night. Like, this is a book club event of a book club that I am a paying member of. Like, I can go to this. So I bought a ticket and I went to the event, and I had to like really psych myself up for it, because I was like, I don't know what I'm doing here. And I had just finished reading Yellowface, and I don't know if you read Yellowface, but basically one girl steals another girl's manuscript, and Savannah stole my life. So I felt like very a kinship to the person whose manuscript was stolen. But she basically hallucinates that she sees her ghost in the audience of a book reading. And I was like, I'm going to go sit in the audience last minute and let her see that I'm there. Just like remind her that there was a human casualty in her writing this book. And I get there and I immediately see that her mom is there. And that's like the one person I wasn't prepared to run into. And I was like, oh my gosh, like I can't talk to her mom. Like there's nothing I could say to her that would make it okay. But basically they came up to me and they were like, hey, are you Izzy? They used my real name, but they were like, hey, are you Izzy? The two women who run the book club. And I was like, yeah. And they were like, so Savannah would like you to leave. And I was like, okay. I guess her mom, I mean, ran back into the green room or whatever and told her I was there. And I basically was like, I'm not here to cause a scene. I promise you, I'm classier than that. I just want her to see me. And they were like, we're so sorry, but she really wanted this to be an anonymous event, which is like a bullshit excuse. And I was like, I didn't use a fake name. I came here, like, and I did. I used my real name when I signed up. And they were like, I could tell that I was putting them in a really tough spot. And that's not fair, right? That's like yelling at a server. Like, that's not that kind of person. I was just like, okay, I'll go. So I left and she never reached out to me. That was it. That was it. So she knows I was there, but she didn't even really even look at me.
And you've never sent her any sort of written note or interaction like that?
I thought about doing something really crazy and sending like a tiny coffin with a nail through it, but
Ooh.
but I refrained. I was like, that's a little psycho. I don't need a restraining order against me. So I was like, no. And actually, this is like, because it's been out for a year now, I've read the reviews. I've looked up what she's said in interviews and things. I actually like, I'm using this as an opportunity to be like, okay, I'm closing the chapter of this for now that I'm like telling my side of the story. So yeah, I have not reached out to her since then. And honestly, I think if she reached out to me, I don't think I would respond.
Speaking of legal action and restraining orders, the moment this all came out, was there ever a part of you that wanted to just urgently start talking to a lawyer, doing research, and seeing if what had actually been done is legal?
Yes. And I have a case, but she maintains that the book is not reality, that Savannah is based off of a little sister version of her. She knows that I can't come after her because of some of the things that she says about my brother, and it would just make his life really miserable.
As you're coming on this podcast, how much of you kind of wants her to come across this and hear it?
Such a good question. I think about this a lot. Part of me really wants her to hear it because I want her to know that she hurt me and that what she did really wasn't okay. But the other part of me really doesn't want to antagonize her because she's done enough damage and it could have been worse. It's twofold. And that's one of the reasons that I want to remain anonymous, because she can always drag all of this out again and make it a misery for everyone involved. But at the same time, like, I really do feel that this was so unjust to do to someone who was like her longest and oldest friend. And I felt almost ashamed about the whole situation. And then I ran into one of our like best mutual friends from high school in the subway, who neither of us are close with anymore. And we were looking at each other and she was like, I have to ask if you read the book. And I was like, of course I read the book. And she goes, I refuse to read that fucking book. One of our other mutual friends read it and said that it was the meanest thing he ever read. And I felt so validated in that moment. And I was like, okay, so there are people from my past who have read this and do see through it. Because I think one of my biggest fears was that, people who I grew up with, who I don't necessarily care what they think, but who know who I am. Like, I hated the idea that they were going to read this and think that I was some, I don't know, like transphobic, small-minded monster.
Which part do you feel like affects you more? Is it the loss of the friendship that you had since childhood, or is it the humiliation that surrounds the coming out of the book?
I think it's more the loss. Like, I was listening to Chapel Roan in the car the other day, and I was like, oh God, we would jam out to this song so hard. I think that, and I think it was just, to me also, it was such I want to say like a blow to my ego, but I don't mean it in the sense that like a large ego. I mean to the sense of like, the person I see myself as, to be put in such a reductive box of like, this person doesn't get it. They're never going to get it. They're never going to be the person I need them to be. And that was, I think, actually the hardest part for me to deal with, where I was like, I will just never be able to change the way that other people see me because of things that I mean, I am in control of. Like, I could go out and get an undercut and pierce my septum, and then maybe people will look at me on the street and know who I vote for. But like, I'm just a pearl wearing like mom in Connecticut, and if you want to assume that you know what I think based off of that, then that's your prerogative.
This might be a reductive question, and I absolutely don't mean to imply that just because two girls who are friends who both happen to be bisexual must be into each other. However,
Yeah,
was
sure.
there ever a part of you that thought that maybe there was some jealousy when you got into your engagement? Like, did you ever feel there was sexual tension between the two of you?
Honestly, no. People have asked me that. Like one of my aunts, again, my whole family knows her. So one of my aunts asked me that, and she was like, "Do you think it's because she's in love with you?" And I was like, "I really don't." And she actually brings it up in the book because at one point, her and her friends are going through like a file of pictures of the two of us, which is a real file, by the way, on her computer called File X, which was mostly just embarrassing photos of me that she had thousands of from, a decade plus of friendship together. And they were like, "Are you in love with this girl? Like, what are all these pictures?" And she's like, "No, it just wasn't that." And I don't ever think it was sexually charged. To me, it wasn't. And I feel like I would have known if it was.
It's just interesting to me that that would be in the book at all, because it just sort of shows that there's a part of her brain as the author that wrote that had that thought,
I think that was actually a real conversation she lifted from her life.
in which case it's something that has gone through her mind.
Yeah.
If you could put yourself in her shoes, not in Savannah in the book shoes, but the actual author of this book, what do you think she would say? What do you think she would cite as her reason for this friendship falling apart?
I have thought about that a lot, actually. And I always think about it from her perspective, not from like book her's perspective, because book her is like the person she thinks that she is and not the person I think that she is.
Right.
But I think, honestly, I think she felt like she couldn't be the person that she wanted to be as long as I was her best friend. I honestly think that was it. I don't know if she'd put it in those words. I think maybe she'd say, I was constantly holding myself back, or I didn't feel seen. But I think it was really more that, like, she felt like she couldn't break out of her mold when we were together. Like, I actually think it was like she felt very vulnerable. There's a part in the book where we're on the phone, and this is an invented conversation where I said something like, "I'm going to buy a Gucci belt." And she's like, "You're not going to buy $1,000 belt." And I'm like, "Who are you to tell me I'm not going to buy $1,000 belt when you're like the one who's always been into material things and, designer clothes?" I think that for her is really vulnerable to have someone who knows who she was and where she comes from before this like invented version of herself. Because if you look at her online persona, it is so different than the person that she grew up as. And I am all for, you should be who you want to be out in the world. But there is also a level of acknowledgement. When you come from an exceedingly wealthy family and you have a multi-million-dollar trust fund and you are pretending that you're a struggling author in Brooklyn, that is a lie. And I think that it's absolutely fair to want to be seen a certain way and to be part of the queer community, which is really important to her. But I think it scares her that people would think of her as a phony. And I think that I was tied to that for her because I will always know that she grew up the way that she grew up. And I will always know her parents and things about her that maybe she doesn't want people to know about her.
Do you think there was any interaction from either your childhood or more of your adulthood days with her that would make her feel like any real interactions that happened that you can remember that maybe would have made her feel judged or would have made her feel like you were not accepting of this new lifestyle she was living?
That's a great question. I think maybe at the very beginning when she first was dating her first woman, I think maybe she felt self-conscious then because I didn't necessarily like this person. And it had nothing to do with their gender. I just thought that she was kind of annoying. And I had said that before they started dating. And I remember very well because Savannah was like, "Oh, do you remember so and so?" And I was like, "Oh, yeah, that annoying girl from the party." And she was like, "Oh, we're dating." And I was like, "Okay, well, I'm really happy for you, first of all. Like, so happy you're in a consensual, happy, romantic relationship." But I think that that actually could have been a bit of a trigger at the beginning for sure, especially when it's like a newer type of relationship that you're exploring.
What I find so fascinating about stories like this, specifically when you have a friend who comes to you and tells you a story of something that happened to them, the way that we as listeners receive the story and who we think is, quote, right. Not that one
Mhm.
side of the story or one player in the story needs to be the crazy one or the wrong one, but everyone sort of
Mhm.
develops a subjective take on which side is good and which side is bad. We're getting one account. We're hearing the story from you. What would you say to our audience who is listening, who's thinking, we're only getting your side of the story here? How do we know that you're not the quote crazy one in this scenario? Or how do we know
Sure.
that you're not the one who is telling the story wrong and that her story is accurate?
I mean, I think that's a question you always have to ask yourself, right? I would say, you can read her perspective. Absolutely. I'm sure that in some places the truth lies somewhere in the middle. I think for me, like, one of the things, those things that comes up a lot is that idea of boundaries, right? Because I think that we are at a time where a lot of us have spent time in therapy, and I think that's a really good thing. But I think we have found the line of where is protecting your peace versus being a shitty friend. Because I do think that line exists. Like if you have a friend going through a really hard time, how much of it is your duty to be there for them? And when do you say, I can't do this anymore for my mental health? And I think the other aspect of it is putting really personal details of someone's life, plagiarizing my childhood without my consent is a pretty shitty thing to do.
Given that in the book she has those pages where she is kind of writing to you in the first person and
Mm-hmm.
talking directly to you, I would like to, at the end of this podcast, give you a chance to say something to her if she does happen to be listening. What do you want her to hear?
I guess I would just say that I hope that it was worth it for you. I imagine that it's been really hard for you to not have a career that you feel proud of, and I hope that throwing away 15 years of the most intimate friendship of your entire life for 5 minutes of recognition is worth it because it wasn't worth it for me. I don't think it would ever be worth it. I would never have done this to you.
Do you feel like your overwhelming emotion is sadness or anger?
It's both. I mean, I feel so sad that she's not in my life in so many ways. I really do. And I feel really angry because I don't feel like I deserve this. I don't feel like my family deserved this. You can write a book. It does not have to be taken from someone's life. That's the truth. Is it's like you wrote a fiction book, let it be fiction. And to have no consideration, to not ask me about putting my assault in there, to say nasty things about my friends and my parents is just so disturbing. That makes me mad because they didn't deserve it. Like she trashes a bunch of my friends from book, talking about like, oh, those stupid sorority girls with their weak handshakes. Like, what did they ever do to you? You know?
Mm.
I'm sorry you didn't like them. That wasn't very nice. It's also just really reductive. Like, you couldn't see them as anything other than girls in a sorority when that is like the opposite of feminism and you're supposed to be this prophetic feminist when you can't let anyone outside of the box unless they are, this raging stereotype of a liberal that you want them to be. And I just feel like that's so backwards. And that's anger. That makes me angry. But I do feel really sad that it's just like I look back on all of these sweet memories and they're tarnished.
Well, I want to thank you majorly for coming on the podcast and for opening up about this and for writing to me in the first place. Going back to my question of who's right or who's crazy or who's wrong, which is beside the point, I think it's important that everyone have a platform to be able to tell their perspective on it. And I'm, grateful that the show is able to give you that. And I also just want to share, regardless of the actual story or regardless of the reason, losing a friend, specifically a really close childhood girlfriend, is traumatic and is something that throughout my life I've had falling outs with different friends for different reasons. Not quite as dramatic, or not in the case where there's a book written about it. But even the ones that are not blasted on a public scale kind of leave these weird wounds and scars that I can totally relate to being an adult now and maybe not even, quote, caring about having this friendship right now in your life. But it still feels very much like there's an open wound there.
Yeah.
And that it's just not closed. You didn't get that closure that you need, and it's like looming over your head. And, I really can't imagine it happening on the scale of it being a public affair where then other people in your life are privy to all the information about it. So I'm sorry that emotionally this had to be something that you went through. And if Savannah is out there listening and you have a take or a response or a reply, please feel free to write into the show. We can facilitate this anonymous dialogue back and forth on the show. But I just really thank you for your time and for opening up. And I hope that you feel like you were able to say everything you wanted to say.
I really appreciate that, Lucie. And I'm so grateful that you have a platform that you allowed me to speak on, and that I got to share my side of the story after reading the original side of the story. And I am very grateful. Thank you.
Thank you so much for tuning in to The Real Stuff. I'm Lucie Fink. Don't forget to follow the show on social media at The Real Stuff Pod. And if you're liking these episodes, please head over to Apple Podcasts and leave us a written review. It helps the show so much. And if you're feeling called to come on the show, visit luciefink.com/apply and tell us your story. We'll see you next week for another intimate conversation on The Real Stuff.